Hello and welcome to the Jay Show. This is Dr. Jay Smith here in London, and with me I have the beautiful Sarah Foster. Good to have you back again.
Thank you. Good to be here.
This is our fourth episode now where we're looking at slavery. And you've been brought up always, of course I have as well. In fact, I would imagine everybody who's watching this show has been brought up really with only one narrative. And that narrative is that slavery is a European problem, is a Christian problem, that there is only one history of slavery, and that's the transatlantic slavery. But you are particularly keen on this subject because it's part of your history. It's part of your own personal history because you are a descendant of slaves yourselves. You're interested in history, and you did some study, and you found out that there is not just one narrative. There is not just one slavery history. It is not just the Atlantic slave trade that exists. There's actually another, even bigger slave trade that no one's talked about. This is the elephant in the room, and that is the Islamic slave trade that didn't just last for 400 years. It has lasted for 1400 years and still exists today. Now, you've gone public with this. You're doing research on it. I want to thank you so much for coming and helping us to unpack it in these episodes here. But you also went one step further. You also went to a country that has actually benefited from a tourism of slavery, you might say, a touristic trade of North Americans who come to Gambia, the country of Gambia, to redress or to find their history, their African history. And you went to this country that's economically completely dependent on this tourism, and you dared to go into the university there and do a lecture on a much bigger problem just a few months ago. And you said you're not telling the whole picture here. But you feel that it's important that we go back and look at the historical record. And it's also important that we go back and look at the revelatory record, and also look back at what people have said in history and what the Bible says versus what the Quran says. You brought up a whole other area that I never heard about, coloration. I didn't even know there was that study even existed. And you introduced that in our first 3 episodes. We're going to get into that more as we move on. But what I want to do today in episode 4 is to go and ask the question, what is slavery? And then I want to move into slavery in the Bible itself. I want to look and see what the Bible says about slavery. So let's start with that first definition, slavery. Sarah, how would you define slavery, and how do people define slavery today?
I usually ask this question when I start my talks, what does slavery mean? And I get a range of responses, and they usually are all negative. So slavery is something that nobody should do. Slavery is taking someone from their home and just forcing them to do work for no pay. And slavery is just diabolical. And so these are the kind of responses I get. And I looked at the BBC website to see, well, how did they define slavery? And they came up with one of these definitions. Slavery is one of those things that everybody agrees is unethical. And I think that's pretty much the consensus here in the West.
Okay, so everybody in the West, and you're making that distinction there. I would suggest, yes, here in Europe and in America and many of your Western countries, that would be the case. But that's not always been the case. In fact, you and I have been at Speaker's Corner. We've been up on the ladder here in London, and almost immediately when they say a black woman and a white man standing up there, they have called you my slave.
Yes, all the time.
All the time. It's almost like a default reaction. They meaning the Muslims. And these Muslims are not coming, they're usually Muslims who are tourists here. They have not been brought up here in Europe. They don't have that European understanding of slavery. They still assume that a black person should be a slave. The word they use for slave in Arabic is abid. And that's the word that's given to black people, abid.
Yeah.
And we've had to sit there and look at them and say, well, you can see there's a clash, not just of culture, but that also suggests that there's something about Islam that sees that as a default. Black people are slaves by default. It's coming out in their reactions. Now, so certainly not everybody believes that slavery is wrong. And we're going to find out that the Quran does not believe that slavery is wrong. We're also going to find out that many of the great thinkers of Islam did not find slavery was wrong. But let's go back and let's see what else. Give me some other help here with where slavery and how we define it and where this idea comes from that slavery is wrong.
Yeah.
You're going to help me there. I'm not going to ask you to answer it right now, but let's unpack this and see what we find.
Well, slavery is such an emotive topic. As I said, people think about the transatlantic slave trade if you're living in the West. If you're an Arab Muslim, you've rightly said, sometimes they think of black people as a bead. In fact, I think even in America, in New York, in the late 2000s, people were saying to Muslims, Arab Muslims, stop calling us abds, stop calling us abids, because it was so common out there that they were calling black people, black Muslims, abds, slaves. And so
Abd Allah, slave of Allah.
not even the Allah bit, just abd, just slave. And
But that's the word abd, the same word that we see, Abdullah.
Abdullah is slave of Allah, but they were just calling the Arab Muslims were just calling the black Muslims abd. It was reported, I think, in the New York Times. And so there's always this tension about slavery. Everybody thinks that they know what it means, but we're not really defining it. So this is why I was interested in definitions, and I looked at that BBC one, which is the common consensus here in the West. But if we go back a bit, and if we just think about some of these things.
Slaves are property essentially no different than a farm implement or a domesticated animal, so a thing.
A thing. So the humanity is completely gone. You can be a garden hoe, it says, or just a fork that you use. You could literally be someone that just dries the dishes. You're like the dishwasher, you're the towel.
Why that's significant is because Aristotle, 4th century BC, Roman law, that's from the 2nd century on. That would be the view of slavery during the New Testament times then.
Yeah.
So it was just a thing, a chattel, didn't have any rights. So the New Testament was, and we're going to get it to the New Testament, is written in that context. That's important.
In that
Did
context.
you bring that up? That's good.
Yeah, we will bring it up when we're looking at Jesus and the disciples. But yeah, so at Aristotle's time, no humanity whatsoever. What right do you have to own anything? You are just a tool. You could be the pen. I just use you to write, or I use you to wash up, or I use you to cook. I use you to play music for me. That's all you are. And so we find that. Orlando Patterson, now he's a famous sociologist. He was at Harvard, and he talks about slavery as being a process of dishonor and alienation and social death. He coins this term social death, which I think is quite interesting. So you can be in society, you can be walking around, but you're not really part of society. So, for example, you could maybe say akin to people who are living in the UK or live in whatever country you're in, but don't have rights to vote, don't have rights to work, don't have rights to do anything. They're completely dependent on someone else. So you're in the society, you're in the social realm, but you're really just like the walking dead.
You do not participate. You do not have. You cannot participate in many of the freedoms that humans have. And yet these are humans who cannot participate. There's nothing there to be seen, not heard.
Exactly, you're not really noticed.
Okay.
You're walking around, but your humanity's not really noticed.
And there's no recompense. I guess the only recompense would be your livelihood. You'd be given something to eat and a place to sleep. Mm-hmm. But other than that, and clothes to wear.
And you should be grateful for that.
And that's right. Okay. But no financial recompense.
No.
This is nothing to do with servanthood or being employed. This is completely. So that's the definition that Orlando Patterson is referring to.
So he's coming from a concept of absolute power.
Yeah.
So the slave has no power whatsoever. The master has complete control over the slave's affairs, and this is what we see in the transatlantic slave trade as well.
It's fascinating because that's also the definition that many Muslims say they consider when they see themselves vis-a-vis their God. They are Abdallahs, slaves of God. They cannot criticize, they cannot talk to, they cannot quarrel with, they cannot argue with, they just obey.
Yes.
And Islam means to be in obedience.
Another important person, he's the leading scholar in Western slavery, David Bryan Davis, and he says this, he hails from Yale. He says, the more we learn about slavery, the more difficulty we have in defining it, which is an interesting point.
Okay.
What he's saying is slavery has meant so many different things in so many different time periods that it's very difficult to define it. Does it mean complete, absolute power, as Aristotle is saying and as Orlando Patterson is saying? Or could there be a type of slavery where the slave does have some power, does have some autonomy, but there's still a master-slave relationship? And he's saying it's not easy to define slavery.
You don't get any better than Yale and Harvard. And these are both scholars from both these institutes. Patterson and Davis are from Harvard and Yale.
Top scholars, and they don't agree on the definition of slavery.
They can't even agree. What do anthropological scholars say?
They don't agree either. They don't agree either. I can read what they've written in their Encyclopedia of Cultural Anthropology. Scholars do not agree on a definition of slavery. The term has been used at various times for a wide range of institutions, including plantation slavery, forced labour, drudgery of factories and sweatshops, child labour, semi-voluntary prostitution, bride price marriage, child adoption for payments, and paid for surrogate motherhood. And they said somewhere within this range is the literal meaning of slavery. Can you see the problem?
Yeah, I can see. Now, this reticence to actually come down to a definition, I guess, is because there are so many models of it. Mm-hmm. If you're going to call this all parts of different categories of slavery, you can see there is going to be a huge confusion.
Yeah, this is where we find difficulty. There's a graph that I've put together, if you can see it on the screen, and it just kind of lays out the spectrum when we're talking about slavery. So at one end we have chattel slavery, that's the Aristotelian slavery we're talking about, when somebody is no better than a garden tool or a farm implement. They could be a pen, they could be a dish rag, whatever the purpose is, that's what they are. They don't have any humanity. They're socially dead, if we're going to use Orland and Patterson's definition. And it goes all the way to total freedom. So on the way, you can have that no humanity. Then you can have, for example, some sweatshop workers. There's been concern with some of the shops in the West that they're using, some famous clothing stores, that they're using effectively slave labourers to do their work. Yes, they're paying them, but it's absolute pittance. And they're working in terrible conditions, and they really have no choice because there's no other work for them. So it's a form of slavery, and so that's why it's on the spectrum. And then maybe here in the West, we have the freedom to work and live wherever we choose. And if you have more money, you have the freedom even not to work if you don't want to. And so these are the grades of slavery to freedom. At the end, I have something interesting, and it's social freedom, and it's in the black because there's a philosopher, and he says total freedom equals death. Total freedom equals death.
Well, it's like anarchy then. If there's complete freedom, if there's no stipulation, no discipline, no restrictions to keep because you, as human beings, if we're totally free, you become completely chaotic, then that would be the death he's referring to.
Yes.
So the graph there is from red to black, red being the chattel slavery on the right, all the way over to the green total freedom, which would be another anarchy.
There has to be form. There has to be some sort of constraints.
Yeah, okay.
And so we're talking about...
So those are the two extremes.
These are the two extremes.
Unfortunately, whereas we don't have total freedom, every society has rules and regulations and disciplines built into it, we do still see chattel slavery on the far right. That's what we're really talking about. It's the chattel slavery that...
Well,
I should be careful of that, because that's not always the definition. You're right.
Well, as we go through this program, we're going to look at slavery in the Bible. In the next episode, probably look at slavery in the Quran, and we're going to be looking at what slavery means. Sometimes we see it used positively, sometimes we see it used negatively. We see it along this spectrum. And so we're going to be looking at what we actually mean when we talk about slavery.
Let's do you've got a nice graph that you've put together comparing ancient Near East with the New World. Explain that, and what is the ancient Near East, and what do you mean by the New World?
So ancient Near East would be the area, so Mesopotamia, the Anatolia area, the Levant. So this would be Muslim-dominated areas right now.
Where Islam is dominated today.
Yeah.
But ancient, this is long before Islam.
So this is the time before Moses in the Bible.
Oh, I see. So 3,400 years ago you're talking about.
It was a long time ago. So over maybe 1,700 years ago to about 2,000 years before Christ, I'm saying.
Before Christ. So
yes.
that would be 3,400 for Moses.
Yes.
So anywhere from 2,000 to 3,400 years ago, long before Islam even came onto the world stage.
Yes.
These are the definitions you're going to give. And what would be the New World then?
So the New World is transatlantic slavery. That's when they're talking about...
So 1400 AD so roughly we're talking about 600 years ago, 700 years ago.
Yes, so when we're talking about New World slavery, we're talking about the transatlantic slavery predominantly. Okay. This is what anthropologists mean.
600 to 400 to 200 years ago versus 3,400 years, way ancient versus near modern, but not modern.
And why it's relevant in our talk today on the Bible is the ancient Near East slavery. We can compare that to the slavery that we find in the Bible. It's interesting to compare that slavery, that's more relevant to the time period, to what we find in the Old Testament. And then with the New World slavery, we can see, actually, was there any comparison with that and what we see in the Bible as well?
Oh, this is interesting. Okay, so what do we find there?
So with the ancient Near East, in terms of motives, how did people get into slavery? What was the predominant method of people getting into slavery? We find that it was poverty in the ancient Near East. There's no welfare system. If you lose your livelihood, for example, the crops fail, you have to sell off your animals, you sell off your grain. What is left? You have yourselves, you have your own labor. So people would sell themselves into slavery.
So it's relief from poverty. To get out of poverty, you sell yourself.
And you said the word relief. So there was a way out. It wasn't that you were selling yourself indefinitely. I think we're going to come on to that. Whereas in the New World slavery, so the transatlantic slavery, people were going into slavery or obtaining slaves just for economic advantage.
The slaves did not choose it, though.
No.
So, whereas with the ancient Near East, the slave chose to give themselves as slaves.
Yeah, ancient Near East.
That was a choice.
It was voluntary most of the time.
And what we're going to find out, we don't want to jump ahead, but the New World slavery, even the Europeans didn't do the enslaving. It was actually internecine warfare. But so these are actually slaves of war, aren't they?
Yep.
These are prisoners of war who then sold to the Arabs, who then sold them to the Europeans. Yeah. Fascinating. So one is a choice, the other was no choice.
Yeah, and we should say even in the ancient Near East, there were slaves that were obtained through war, but predominantly it was relief of poverty.
Look at
to
that.
Get themselves out of poverty.
Okay.
And in the New World, overwhelmingly, it was involuntary. People were stolen from their lands and taken, or it was, spoils of war. Treatment, there was evidence that even in the Hammurabi tablets, some of the tablets that we find in those times, there was some protection from over-abuse. So there were certain things that you could not do to your slave. Whereas in the New World translation, in the New World slavery, there were things that you could do. I mean, there was frequent punishments and beatings and capital punishments for all kinds of things. And so there was a difference.
Well, I can imagine, because if you go voluntary as a slave, you can see you better treat them pretty well, because otherwise you're not going to get many people volunteering to be your slave.
Well, you know what you're signing up for as well.
That's right. Whereas in the other case, if you have no voluntary, if this has been forced on you, you want to leave at any time, and you're going to have enormous punitive measures to keep them there.
Yes.
So almost you can see that you would have huge differences.
If people are forced to be a slave, then you have to force to keep them as a slave.
You have to maintain that force.
Yeah, and they did it through brutal means. Legal status. So this was, there's no clean-cut way of dividing this. It was a mix of family members or property, or they could be agents, relationships, but it wasn't a straightforward, you are my property, like we see with Aristotle's definition. You could be part of the family, and so there was this kind of quasi-family relationship that would develop between slaves and masters in the ancient Near East.
It's fascinating. I grew up in India, and my parents had servants since I was born, and we had one servant named Chedi and another named Ramzan. These two servants, they got paid, but we almost invited them into the family. We gave them places to live. We educated all their children. We went to all their weddings. We paid for the weddings normally, and we certainly have paid for their hospital treatments. They became part of the family. It was, though they were servants and they were being paid themselves, we did an awful lot more. It's that kind of view you're talking about that still exists today, and that was not, we weren't unique. Most of the people that around us in India, and certainly in the missionary community, that's just quite normal to do that. No one would even think of them as being out of the family. They weren't by our biological family, but they were our extended family, so to speak.
And it still happens in many parts of Africa as well. They'll have house servants who will stay with them, but the owners are completely responsible for their medical, food, taking care of them and their family. And so there's this familial ties that develop over time. And the servant can choose to move on. They can choose to, in this case, if they've sold themselves, once they've saved up enough money, they can buy themselves out of slavery, or a family member can buy themselves out of it. But they may want to stay because there's been such close ties drawn between them. Whereas in the New World slavery, it was usually until death. You know, you're forced to be a slave, you're forced to be kept as a slave, and you are not
They were
leaving
property and
until
nothing
you
more.
die. Yeah.
And that stayed till death, okay?
Yeah, it's really quite
So
sad.
there was an exit for the ancient Near East. They could leave.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, some did, others stayed, depending on how they were treated or how much wage they got. Or not wage, Corey, they wouldn't have got wages because they would have been manumissioned on them. But certainly under the New
They
World.
could have got wages. It just depends on the contract that they have when they go into it.
So would they still be called slaves then?
So this is why we're talking about the definition of slavery. Sometimes a slave in the ancient Near East or slaves in biblical times, they're still getting paid. We're going to see that as we move on.
Now we're moving into the definition of servant then. So you can see that it eradicates
Yes.
that distinction between the two, doesn't it?
Yeah, so what is the definition between a slave and a servant? Depending on the time period, you're looking at none. Because if we're just simply talking about someone who has control over you, that could be modern day employment today. Your employer has control over in a certain amount of hours that you're working, what you do, the time that you have there, they have control over you, and they're going to pay you at the end, but you're a free person. So what is a slave? What is a servant? You know, these are things that we need to grapple with.
So we're not going to have any easy definition. But I've been told over and over again that the slavery in the Bible is horrendous. That this is where, if you want to get bad slavery, go back to the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
What I'd like to ask you now, Sarah, you have gone to the Bible, you have looked at the Bible, you've looked at the Old Testament. I'd like to go back and see what the law says about slavery in the Bible. Let's open that up. We only have about 5 minutes to go. So let's try to get started in that subject, and in the next episode we'll continue by looking at the Bible. But let's get to the law. What did the law say for slaves in the Old Testament? Because everything I've ever heard is it was horrendous, it was heinous, and it's because of the biblical model that slavery, the terrible example of slavery that you're talking about in the New World, exists today.
Yes. So, let's start with this point. Everybody would prefer to be free. Everyone would prefer to be free. But the accusation that the slavery we see in the Bible is responsible for what we see in the transatlantic slave trade, I think just doesn't stand up. I have this, when I've spoken to my Muslim friends, and they've told me this over and over again, slavery in the Bible is cruel. It's not like the Islamic slavery. They talk about slavery in the Bible being racist. I think we dealt with that last week, looking at the curse of Ham. Was it a curse of Ham? Was it a curse of Canaan? What did it have to do with the people living in Africa at all? Nothing. So that one was debunked.
And another polemic is that it continues into the New Testament.
Yes.
It doesn't eradicate it, it actually continues it. So these are the three major polemics you're getting, that it's cruel, that it's racist, and that even the New Testament still enjoys it and allows it and permits it, even suggests it. So let's look and see. Let's get and look at the Bible. Let's open up the Bible and let's see exactly what it does say.
Well, if we go back to the time of Moses has just taken the children...
1400 BC.
Yeah. Moses has just taken the children of Israel out of Egypt, and God now is establishing them as a nation. He's forming a nation, and he's starting to give them these laws. And he gives them this law in Deuteronomy 15, verses 4 and 5. He says this, he's making a promise to them. He says, "There will be no poor among you, for the Lord will bless you." When you see Lord in capitals like that, it's standing for the
Tetragrammaton, Yahweh.
Yes. The name that the Israelites, the Jews, used for God.
The one that Moses needed in Exodus 3:15 before he went down, said, "What is your name?" That is the Lord, L-O-R-D. Okay.
The Bible speaks of many gods, but they're false gods. There's only one true God, and he gave his name as Yahweh.
I think we should put Yahweh back in our English Bible. But that's another story.
That's another topic.
Time. Let's
but
continue
it's
this.
very important. We're talking about the Hebrew God. "For the Lord will bless you in the land that your Lord has given you as an inheritance to possess, if only you will strictly obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all that I command you today." And so we're seeing God promises there's not going to be any poor among you. If we remember the main reason for slavery in the ancient Near East, what was it?
Well, it was for people that needed relief from their poverty.
Relief from poverty. So in relieving poverty, it's not God trying to say he's going to try and eradicate slavery.
Yeah.
There doesn't need to be this, you know, you run out of your money, you run out of your grain, you run out of your cattle, and you sell yourself into slavery. He's saying, this will not be the case among you if you obey my commandments. He goes on to say this, but God is a realist. He knows what people are like. They're not going to obey everything. He says, if your brother, and he says this in Leviticus 25:39-40, if your brother does become poor besides you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker and is as a sojourner. He shall serve you until the year of Jubilee.
Okay. Year of Jubilee every 50 years. Okay, so until in other words, there's even an end point to it.
There's an end point.
It doesn't say till death do us part, like we say in marriage. No, this is actually, there's an end point, and it's the year of Jubilee.
Yeah, God is saying, look, there's no need for you to live like this if you obey me. But if your brother does become poor, then don't make him...
He's a hired worker, which means he's also going to be getting recompense for his work. Okay.
And he's not yours forever. He's not property.
What
He's a
about
human
treatment?
being. Yeah, so this is interesting. So we're not now talking about the brother of Jews. We're talking about people who are not Jewish or not Israeli. We're talking about
These
people...
are non-Jews now.
Non-Jews,
Okay,
people
what about...
not in the nation of Israel. It says in Leviticus 19:33-34, when a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall do him no wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as you love yourself. For you are strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God.
That's a beautiful verse.
I love this verse.
I haven't remember reading this. So even when a stranger comes amongst you, don't treat him wrong. He is like a native.
Notice, you don't...
love him as you love yourself.
This stranger doesn't have to pay the jizya tax.
No.
He can just carry on in the land. You love him like you love yourself.
Remember, back in Egypt, you don't want that.
No.
So treat them like you would want to be treated.
And I think this is one of the major differences
There's
we see in the Bible
there,
and the Quran. Yeah, we see the golden rule. We see in the Bible, we see God has allowed his children to go through really difficult times so that they remember. And they remember that it was the Lord himself who brought them out of it.
And never to repeat it again.
Don't repeat it. Don't be cruel like those people who were cruel. Don't treat people badly. Love them as you love yourself.
Okay, let's go to Deuteronomy 23.
Yes, and so this is another really interesting verse. We know in the New World slavery, if a slave runs away, sometimes they were dragged back to their master, and they would put more chains around them, or maybe they'd amputate their foot, or they'd put some sort of implement on them so they can't run away. This is what it says in the Bible in Deuteronomy 23:15-16. You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. You shall not do him wrong.
There you go. Wow.
Yeah. So God doesn't have this, the God of the Bible doesn't have this idea that, it's okay to treat slaves badly. Even if this person is a slave, you have to treat them well. And if the slave is running away, God is saying, it's probably for a reason. Don't send them back to where they came from. You look after them.
Now, we're going to have to end it there. We'll have to come back to this in the next episode, because I want to still continue with this idea that it's such a horrendous view of slavery in the Old Testament. We're not finding that all.
No.
We're finding that actually it's quite benign, it's quite benevolent. In fact, it's the golden rule. This is what we're finding. Sarah, this has been exciting. We're going to unpack it. Don't leave us. We're going to start with our 5th episode, taking up from where we left off here and continuing with the Old Testament, looking and seeing really what the Bible says about slavery. You're going to be shocked. It's going to be a different world than you've been told, but that's why it's important we go back to the source. We go back to the Bible, and as we're going to do with the Quran later on, and see what the text says. God be with you. We'll see you next time. This is Sarah and Jay here in London. Over and out.